The old millionaire fell in love with the mansion's new gardener. The vast garden of the Rosewood mansion had lain dormant for years, like Winona herself. She watched from the window of her second-floor library, the wilted roses and weeds that had taken over what had once been the pride of Hartford, Connecticut. Her wrinkled fingers touched the glass of the window while her blue eyes, still vivid at 72, roamed the length of the garden. "Mrs. Rosewood?" The voice of Margaret, his housekeeper for 3 decades, echoed softly. "The new gardener has arrived." Winona smoothed her silver hair into an elegant bun and turned with the dignity that characterized her posture. "It's about time. The garden has been a disaster since Maxwell retired." Walking down the solid oak stairs, Winona felt a familiar pang of loneliness. Since the death of Herbert, her husband, 5 years ago, the mansion had seemed too big, too quiet. Her 3 children, Richard, Catherine, and Michael, rarely visited, except when they needed to discuss investments or issues related to the business empire Herbert had left behind. In the entrance hall, through the French doors, Winona spotted a male figure examining the bushes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an energy she hadn't seen on her estate for a long time. "Good morning," Winona called out, her voice firm and clear. "You must be Rowan Bennett." The man turned, and Winona felt something unexpected, a little jolt in her heart. Rowan must have been around 35, with intense green eyes and a warm smile that lit up his tanned face. "Ms. Rosewood," he replied, approaching with sure steps. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The references from the Anderson family were impressive, Winona commented, maintaining a professional tone despite the sudden awareness of her own racing pulse. "I hope you can do the same for this garden." Rowan looked around, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "This place has incredible potential. I can see traces of what it once was: the climbing roses, the geometric beds. With dedication and time, we can bring it back to life." Something in the way he spoke, with genuine passion, touched Winona. "You seem to have a real connection with gardens," she observed. "I learned it from my grandmother," he explained, crouching down to examine a rose bush. "She used to say that a garden is like a story. It needs care, patience, and love to flourish." Over the next few weeks, Winona found herself watching Rowan work more and more often. She began to sip her afternoon tea on the terrace, pretending to read, as she watched him methodically transform each bed. His strong but gentle hands seemed to have a special gift. Wherever he touched, life seemed to awaken. One day, when he was pruning the rose bushes, Winona came down to the garden. "How do you know exactly where to cut?" she asked, genuinely curious. Rowan smiled, and without hesitation, held out the pruning shears. "Do you want to learn?" That simple moment marked a change. Over the next few days, Winona began to spend more time in the garden, learning about different plants, pruning techniques, and the secrets of a thriving garden. Their conversations flowed naturally, moving from botany to personal stories. It was during one of these afternoons that Richard, her eldest son, arrived unannounced. He found his mother laughing at something Rowan had said, her hands dirty with dirt, her face flushed in a way he hadn't seen for years. "Mom," Richard's voice cut through the moment like a sharp blade. "What's going on here?" Winona straightened up, feeling the weight of judgment in her son's eyes. "I'm learning about gardening, Richard. Rowan has been an excellent teacher." "We need to talk," Richard said dryly, casting an icy glance at Rowan. In private, that evening, alone in her room, Winona reflected on how her heart had begun to beat differently over the last few weeks. It wasn't just the physical activity of gardening, it was something deeper, scarier, and more exciting than she dared admit. Margaret, arranging the curtains, broke the silence. "The desert roses are blooming, ma'am. First bloom in years." Winona smiled, thinking of how Rowan had insisted that those plants needed just the right amount of attention to thrive. "Sometimes, Margaret, life surprises us when we least expect it." But as she watched the stars from her bedroom window, Winona knew that her children would never understand. To them, she was just Herbert Rosewood's widow, the matriarch who should behave according to her status and age. But for the first time in years, she felt alive, awake, as if spring had finally arrived after a long winter. The garden was changing, and with it, Winona was blossoming too. even if it meant facing a storm brewing on the horizon. The meeting with Richard in the office of the Rosewood Mansion was as tense as the air before a storm. Winona watched her eldest son pacing back and forth, his stern features so reminiscent of Herbert that it hurt. "Mother, you must understand how this looks," Richard began, adjusting his silk tie. "A woman of your position, spending hours in the garden with a employee." Winona remained seated in her leather armchair, her back as straight as ever. "And how exactly does that look, Richard?" "Inappropriate," he shot back. "Inappropriate? People comment. The Anderson family called to ask if everything was all right with you." "People always comment," Winona replied, her voice calm but firm. "They commented when your father expanded the business in the 1970s, when Catherine decided to become an artist, and now they're commenting because I'm learning gardening." Richard stopped in front of the window, overlooking the garden, where Rowan was working, unaware of the discussion going on above. "He's too young to be your friend, Mom, and he's clearly interested in something other than plants." "How can you judge someone you barely know?" Winona asked, feeling an old anger rise in her chest. The same anger she had felt when Richard and the others had tried to convince her to sell the mansion after Herbert's death. "I'm not naive," Richard retorted. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way he smiles. And frankly, I'm worried about your finances. How much are you paying him?" Winona stood up, her blue eyes sparkling. "Your concerns are unfounded, Richard. Rowan's salary is fair and comes from my personal account, not the family trust." That night, after Richard left, Winona couldn't sleep. Her son's words echoed in her mind, mingling with memories of Herbert and the countless times she had to defend her choices to Hartford society. The next morning, she found Margaret preparing breakfast in the kitchen. The housekeeper, who knew every nuance of the Rosewood family, immediately noticed her unease. "Has young Richard's visit upset you, ma'am?" Margaret asked, pouring tea into a china cup. "Richard has always been overprotective," Winona sighed, "ever since I was a child. But sometimes protection turns into control." "If I may say so," Margaret began, hesitantly, "I've never seen you as lively as you've been in recent weeks. The garden is regaining its beauty, and you're blooming too." Winona smiled, touched by her housekeeper's sincere observation. "You know, Margaret, when Herbert died, I thought my life was over, that my role now would only be that of respectable widow, occasional grandmother, and keeper of memories." Through the kitchen window, she spotted Rowan arriving, carrying new flower cuttings. Her heart raced slightly, a feeling she wasn't yet ready to name. "I'm going to the garden," she announced, picking up her sun's hat. In the garden, Rowan was planting lilies, his skilled hands carefully working the soil. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with that smile that had bothered Richard so much. "Good morning, Mrs. Rosewood," he greeted. "I've brought some surprises for the East flower bed." "You can call me Winona," she said, surprising herself. "When we're here in the garden, at least." His smile widened. "Whatever you say, Winona." Over the next few hours, they worked side by side, talking about flowers and life. Rowan talked about her grandmother, who had raised 3 children by herself working as a florist, and her dream of having her own nursery one day. "Why do you work for other people then?" Winona asked, genuinely curious. "I need to earn money first," he explained, wiping the sweat from his brow. "And I learn something new with every garden I tend. Each place has its own story, its own magic." At that moment, Catherine, Winona's middle daughter, appeared in the garden. Unlike Richard, she observed the scene with more curiosity than judgment. "Mommy," Catherine called out, "can we talk?" Inside the house, Catherine got straight to the point. "Richard called me last night, completely upset. He said you were being manipulated." Winona felt the weariness of the situation weigh on her shoulders. "Your mother may be many things, Catherine, but manipulative isn't one of them." "I know," Catherine smiled slightly. "Actually, I came to see for myself. And you know what? You look happier than I've seen you in years." Catherine's words brought tears to Winona's eyes. "But aren't you worried?" "Of course I am," Catherine answered honestly, "but not about what Richard fears. I'm worried that you'll let the fear of other people's judgment stand in the way of your happiness, whatever that means." That night, alone in her room, Winona reflected on her children's different reactions. Richard, always the protector, seeing threats around every corner. Catherine, the artist, seeing beyond appearances. And Michael, the youngest, who still didn't know anything, living on the other side of the country. She approached the dressing table, looking at her reflection. The face that stared back at her was different, more flushed, more alive. Her fingers touched the small wrinkles around her eyes, the marks of a life well lived. "What would you say, Herbert?" she whispered to the portrait of her husband on the wall. "You always said I was too stubborn for my own good." The portrait, of course, remained silent. But Winona could almost hear Herbert's husky laugh, the way he always supported her in her decisions, even when he didn't agree with them. Outside, the night garden exuded the scent of freshly planted flowers, a promise of renewal that went beyond the plants. Winona knew she was at a decision point. She could retreat, remain in the safe role that society expected of her, or she could allow herself to explore these new feelings, regardless of the consequences. The full moon illuminated the garden, creating dancing shadows among the flowers. Somewhere, a cricket sang its nightly serenade, and Winona smiled, remembering Rowan's words about the magic of every garden. News of the close relationship between Winona and the gardeners spread through Hartford like pollen on the wind. Michael, Winona's youngest son, flew in from San Francisco as soon as Richard alerted him to the situation, completing the trio of Rosewood children reunited for the first time since the previous Christmas. In the mansion's library, the three brothers gathered to discuss what Richard called the situation. Winona could hear their muffled voices through the oak door as she pretended to read in the adjoining room. "She's being naive." Richard's voice sounded as authoritative as ever. "He's clearly interested in her fortune. Or perhaps," Catherine argued, "she's simply living her life after 5 years of mourning." Michael, ever the mediator, sighed audibly. "We need to think about her well-being, but also her reputation. People are already talking about it." Winona slammed her book shut, causing a pop that momentarily silenced the conversation in the library. Her fingers traced the cover of the volume. She hadn't even begun to read a treatise on old roses that Rowan had recommended. In the garden, through the window, she could see Rowan working on a new flower bed. His deft hands moved with precision as he planted a row of blue hydrangeas, her favorites, as he had discovered during one of their long conversations. "Madam," Margaret entered the room quietly, "I've brought your afternoon tea." Winona smiled at her housekeeper. "Thank you, Margaret. How's the mood in the kitchen today?" "The staff are curious," Margaret replied diplomatically. "But you know how things are, they'll soon find something else to gossip about." "When Herbert was alive," Winona commented, picking up her cup, "no one questioned my decisions. It was as if his presence conferred some kind of immunity on me." "If I may say so," Margaret hesitated, "Mr. Rosewood always said that your strength was what he admired most about you." A sound of chairs being dragged in the library indicated that the siblings' meeting was over. Moments later, Catherine entered the room, her artistic eyes immediately noticing the way her mother was observing the garden. "You know," Catherine began, taking a seat next to Winona, "when I left law school to study art, you were the only one who supported me." "Because that's what made you happy," Winona replied simply. "Exactly," Catherine smiled. "And now it's my turn to support your happiness, even if the others don't understand." At that moment, Richard and Michael entered the room, their serious expressions contrasting with the soft afternoon light coming through the windows. "Mom," Michael began, his tone conciliatory, "we just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm better than I've been in years," Winona replied, straightening up in her chair. "And frankly, I'm tired of justifying every aspect of my life to you." "It's not that simple," Richard interjected. "There are legal issues to consider. The company's board is concerned that—" "The company?" Winona interrupted him, her voice sharp. "Is that what they're really worried about? That I might somehow damage the precious empire your father built?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, Rowan had stopped working, looking towards the mansion as if he could feel the tension emanating from it. "Let me be clear," Winona continued, standing up. "I'm a grown woman, widowed, yes, but still alive. What I do with my time, who I choose to spend my days with, are my decisions." "But Mom," Michael tried. What if he's just what? Winona challenged him. Taking advantage of a silly old woman? You haven't even bothered to get to know him, to see how he's brought life not just to this garden, but to this whole house. Catherine, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. She's right. When was the last time we saw Mom truly happy? Richard ran his hand over his face, a gesture so reminiscent of Herbert that it made Winona's heart squeeze. We can't just ignore the risks. What risks? Winona asked. Of me living? Of me feeling? Of me discovering that I can still have joy at 72? At that moment, Margaret re-entered the room. Mrs. Rosewood, Rowan asks if you would still like to see the new design for the winter garden. 4 pairs of eyes turned to Winona. She stood up with dignity, smoothing her dress. Tell him I'll be there in a moment. Mother, Richard began, but Winona held up her hand, silencing him. My dear children, she said, her voice soft but firm, you are the light of my life, but you can't protect me from living. You can't keep me in a bubble like a delicate flower. I need the sunlight, I need the open air. I need the freedom to grow in unexpected directions. She walked to the door, pausing for a moment. And if you really care about me, you'll learn to accept that. In the garden, Rowan was waiting for her with his meticulous plans for the winter garden. His green eyes sparkled as he watched her approach, and Winona felt that now familiar warmth in her chest. Is everything all right? He asked softly, noticing her expression. It will be, she replied, smiling. Now, show me what you plan to do with that abandoned space. As they pored over the drawings, discussing possibilities and dreams for the garden's future, Winona felt the gazes of her children through the mansion's windows. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't care what anyone thought. Like the roses Rowan had taught her to grow, she was determined to flourish, even if it meant facing a few thorns along the way. The morning after the confrontation with her children, Winona woke up with renewed determination. The Connecticut sun filtered through the silk curtains, creating dancing patterns in her room, reminding her of the shadows the leaves cast in the garden during her conversations with Rowan. Margaret entered with breakfast, also carrying an envelope. It arrived this morning, ma'am. It's from Mr. Richard's office. Winona took the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. Inside, she found legal documents, a proposal to establish a trusteeship over her estate. Her heart raced with indignation as she read the terms that would essentially strip her of control over her own financial life. They really think I've lost my mind, she muttered, letting the papers fall to the breakfast table. If I may, ma'am, Margaret said, setting down the tray. Mr. Herbert always said that you were the most sensible person he knew. Winona smiled at the memory. Herbert also said that our children had inherited my stubbornness and his sense of control, a dangerous combination. Later that morning, while walking through the garden, Winona found Rowan working on a new project, a maze of low bushes that he had suggested weeks before. Good morning, he smiled when he saw her, but his smile dimmed when he noticed her worried expression. Is everything all right? My children are trying to declare me incompetent, she replied, taking a seat on a nearby bench. Apparently, developing feelings for someone younger is a sign of senility. Rowan put down his tools and sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. I'm sorry. Maybe I should resign. No, Winona replied firmly. I won't let them control my life like that. But I don't want to cause problems between you and your family, he argued, his soft voice laden with concern. The problems existed long before you arrived, she sighed. They never accepted that I could have a life of my own after Herbert's death. To them, I'm just his father's widow, the guardian of the Rosewood legacy. At that moment, Catherine appeared in the garden, walking hurriedly towards them. Mom, I've just spoken to Richard. How dare he? Winona watched her daughter approach, noticing how her artistic eyes had already picked up on the tension of the scene. Catherine had always been the most perceptive of the three. Rowan, Catherine said, surprising them both. Could you give us a moment? He nodded respectfully and walked away, leaving mother and daughter alone on the park bench. Richard has hired Peterson and Associates, Catherine informed them, referring to a prestigious law firm. He's really getting on with it? I know, Winona replied, showing the documents she had brought with her. "They arrived this morning." "That's ridiculous. You're more lucid and alive than all of us put together," Catherine exclaimed, running her eyes over the papers. "Is Michael on his side?" "Your brother has always been easier to influence," Winona sighed. "Richard has probably convinced him that he's acting for my own good." On the other side of the garden, Rowan continued his work, his tense back showing that he was aware of the seriousness of the situation. Winona watched him for a moment, feeling a mixture of tenderness and guilt. "You really like him, don't you?" Catherine asked softly. "He makes me feel alive again," Winona confessed. "Not just as Herbert's widow or the Rosewood matriarch, but as myself, Winona." Catherine took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "Then fight. I'll be by your side." That afternoon, Winona called a meeting with her 3 children in her personal office, the same place where Herbert used to conduct the family business. She sat in the leather chair behind the imposing mahogany desk, a position of power that was not lost on any of them. "Before you start," she said when everyone was seated, "I want you to understand something. I'm not a child who needs to be protected, nor am I a fool who's lost her mind." "Mom," Richard tried to intervene, but she silenced him with a look. "No, Richard. Now you're going to listen to me." Her voice was firm. "For 45 years, I've been the wife of Herbert Rosewood. I helped build this family, this legacy. I raised 3 wonderful children and ran this house while your father built the empire you now run." She paused, looking at each of her children. "But before I was Mrs. Rosewood, I was Winona. And after your father left, I had to rediscover who I was without him." "We understand that," Michael said softly, "but this relationship isn't right. Appropriate?" Winona laughed humorlessly. "What exactly isn't appropriate? That I've found joy again? That I've allowed myself to feel something for someone who sees me as a person, not as a title or a social position?" "He's too young," Richard argued. "People are talking." "People always talk, Richard," Winona interrupted him. "They talked when your father married a middle-class woman. They talked when Catherine chose art over law, and they'll talk now. But I won't live my last years trying to please Hartford society." Catherine, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. "She's right. We can't lock her up in a gilded cage just because we're afraid of change." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions and unexpressed fears. Outside, the garden was beginning to show the first signs of dusk, the shadows lengthening among the flowers Rowan had so carefully planted. "The documents you sent this morning, Richard," Winona said at last, "can be collected by your messenger tomorrow, and signed." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I love you, my children, but I need you to trust me enough to let me live my life with all the risks and joys it may bring." As her children left the office, Winona stood at the window, watching the garden where Rowan still worked. Like the flowers he had cultivated with such care, his heart was blooming again, defying the seasons and everyone's expectations. It was time to live his own spring, regardless of what anyone else thought. Autumn arrived in Hartford with a sudden change in the weather, bringing with it cold winds that shook the century-old trees of the Rosewood estate. Winona watched the golden leaves dance across the garden as she ate breakfast on the terrace, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. "The gardener's here early today," Margaret commented, pouring more coffee. "He's getting the garden ready for winter." Winona nodded, watching Rowan work. Over the last few weeks, since the confrontation with their children, a new dynamic had been established at the mansion. Catherine visited more often, bringing her painting materials to capture the changing colors of the garden. Richard kept his distance, communicating only through his lawyer. Michael had returned to San Francisco, torn between loyalty to his brothers and his own uncertainty about the situation. "Ma'am," Margaret hesitated, "there are rumors in town. Apparently, Mr. Richard has been talking to some members of the company's board." "About my supposed incompetence?" Winona asked, keeping her voice steady despite the pain she felt. "Let them talk, Margaret. I've faced worse storms." In the garden, Rowan looked up and waved, his smile lighting up the gray morning. Winona returned the gesture, feeling that familiar warmth in her chest. Over the last few months, their connection had deepened through honest conversations and moments shared among the flowers. "I'm going down to the garden," she announced, getting up. "We need to discuss the preparations for winter." On the way down to the garden, Winona reflected on how her life had changed. The gossip of Hartford society didn't bother her as much as the pain of seeing her own family split apart. The weight of the Rosewood name, which had always been her anchor, now felt like a chain trying to pull her back into a role that no longer served her. "Good morning," Rowan greeted as she approached. "I was thinking of protecting the climbing roses with straw before the first frosts arrive." "You always think ahead," she smiled, watching as his skilled hands worked the soil. "How is your grandmother?" "Better," he replied, his eyes softening at the mention of his grandmother. "The new treatment is working. She asked about you, you know. She said she'd like to meet the woman who makes me smile so much." The comment hung between them, loaded with meaning. Before Winona could reply, she heard Catherine's voice calling from the terrace. "Mom, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." In her office, Catherine seemed agitated. "Richard has called an extraordinary board meeting for next week. He's trying to use his influence to get a compulsory psychiatric assessment." Winona sat down heavily in her chair. "Does he really think he can force me into this?" "He's using the argument that your recent decisions could affect the family business," Catherine explained, running a hand through her hair in frustration. "But there's more. He's hired a private investigator to look into Rowan." "What?" Winona felt her heart race. "He doesn't have that right." "I agree, but..." Catherine hesitated. "Mom, how much do you really know about Rowan?" The question hit Winona like a punch. She knew Rowan through his conversations, his actions, his kindness. She knew his heart. But the practical details of his life? The Anderson family references had been her only formal verification. "I trust him," she finally said. "I know you do," Catherine replied softly. "But perhaps we should be prepared for anything Richard might find out." That afternoon, as she walked through the garden alone, Winona felt the weight of her choices. The roses she and Rowan had planted together were blooming one last time before winter, their red petals contrasting with the autumn sky. "Mrs. Rosewood?" Rowan's voice surprised her. He was standing a few meters behind her, holding a briefcase. "I think we need to talk." Sitting down on the stone bench, Rowan opened the folder and began to speak. "Your son hired someone to investigate me. I thought you should find out a few things for me first." "You don't have to do that," Winona began, but he gently interrupted her. "Yes, I do. Because what I feel for you is too real to be tainted by half-truths." He took a deep breath. 5 years ago, I was broke. I lost everything trying to maintain a nursery that didn't work out. I had to start again from scratch, working in other people's gardens to support my sick grandmother. Winona listened in silence, her heart squeezed. The Anderson family references are true. I worked for them for 3 years. But before that, I made mistakes. I tried to get a loan using false documents. I got caught, but the Anderson family gave me a second chance when they found out it was to pay for my grandmother's treatment. "Why are you telling me this now?" Winona asked softly. "Because I want you to know who I really am, before your son uses it against us." "I'm not perfect, Winona. I've made mistakes, but I have never, not for a moment, approached you out of interest in your money or position." Silent tears streamed down Winona's face. They weren't tears of disappointment, but of deep understanding of how much this honesty cost him. "When Herbert died," she finally said, "I thought I would never feel anything so strongly about anyone again. You proved me wrong, not because you were perfect, but because you were real." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the garden, the flowers bravely resisted the autumn wind, just as Winona resisted the pressure to conform to other people's expectations. "What do we do now?" Rowan asked, his voice heavy with concern. "We keep looking after the garden," Winona replied with a small smile. "And we face whatever comes, together." The words hung in the air like the last leaves of fall, carrying promise and uncertainty. The storm Richard had been preparing for was approaching, but Winona had found her strength not in the walls of Rosewood Manor or in the name it bore, but in the garden where her heart had learned to bloom again. The news of Rowan's past spread quickly through Hartford's social circles. Richard had made sure of it, discreetly distributing the private investigator's findings among key members of local society. Autumn was advancing, and with it, a growing sense of siege around Rosewood Manor. Winona was in her office, reviewing documents with her personal lawyer, Arthur Thorne, when Margaret rushed in. "Ma'am, there are reporters from the Hartford Courier at the gate. They're asking for a comment on, well, about everything." Winona sighed, leaving the papers on the table. "So Richard decided to make it public?" "Technically," Arthur interjected, adjusting his glasses, "he only shared information with people concerned for his welfare. The leak to the press can't be directly linked to him." "Always so careful, my son," Winona commented with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You've learned well from your father." In the garden, through the office window, Rowan continued his work, apparently oblivious to the commotion his presence had caused. But Winona noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he occasionally glanced towards the main gate, where the reporters were crowding. "Arthur," Winona turned to her lawyer, "what are my legal options?" "Well," he began, leafing through his notes, "Richard's attempt to establish a trusteeship is flimsy. You're clearly in full control of your mental faculties. The bigger problem is reputation, both yours and the company's." "The company," Winona repeated bitterly. "It always comes back to that, doesn't it? The precious Rosewood legacy." Catherine arrived that afternoon, bringing with her newspaper cuttings and prints from social media. The story was being discussed everywhere, with opinions divided between those who saw forbidden romance and others who suspected an elaborate scam. "Some are even romanticizing the story," Catherine commented, showing a local blog, calling it the Hartford fairy tale. "Your grandmother would be horrified," Margaret said, pouring tea. "She always said that the Rosewoods should remain above gossip." "My grandmother also thought that women shouldn't wear pants," Winona replied with a small smile. "Times change." In the evening, after everyone had left, Winona found Rowan in the winter garden, where he was finalizing the installation of a new irrigation system. The twilight filtered through the glass, creating elongated shadows. "You don't have to stay here any longer," she said softly. "I understand if you want to leave." Rowan put down his tools and turned to face her. "Is that what you want?" "I want you to be happy," she replied, "free from scandal and judgment." "Do you know what makes me happy?" he asked, stepping closer. "Watching these plants grow, seeing this garden come to life again, and above all, seeing you smile when we discover a new rosebud or when the hydrangeas change color." Silent tears streamed down Winona's face. "My whole life has been defined by others, daughter of, wife of, mother of. For the first time, I'm choosing my own path, and that terrifies my children. Because they don't understand that love has no age," Rowan said softly, taking her hand. "That sometimes we find light in the most unexpected places." At that moment, they heard excited voices coming from the house. Michael had arrived from San Francisco, and from the tone of his argument with Catherine in the hall, he wasn't happy. "I have to go," Winona said, reluctant to let go of Rowan's hand. One more battle to fight. In the hall, Michael looked exhausted from the trip, but his expression brightened when he saw his mother. "Mom," he hugged her tightly. "Why didn't you tell me about all this?" "Because you already had so much going on in your life," she replied, touching his face. "The new baby, the job." "But you're my mother," he insisted. "You should be able to count on me." Catherine watched the scene with attentive eyes. Did Michael come because Richard persuaded him, or because he wanted to? "I came because I needed to see for myself," he replied, looking out at the garden through the French doors. "To meet this man who has caused such a stir." "Then meet him," Winona said firmly. "Talk to him. Judge for yourself, not by the reports of a private investigator or the vicious comments of society." Later, after Michael had retired to rest, Winona found Catherine on the terrace, painting the night garden. Rowan's strategically placed lights created a play of shadows that his daughter captured with precise brushstrokes. "Do you know what impresses me most?" Catherine commented without taking her eyes off her canvas. "How you're stronger now than ever. Because I finally understood that happiness isn't something we should postpone or deny for fear of other people's judgment," Winona replied, looking up at the stars. "Your father used to say that life is too short to live for others. Dad was always wiser than he showed," Catherine smiled. Remember how he supported my decision to study art, even when the whole family opposed it? Herbert understood about following one's heart, Winona said softly. He would have understood that too. The night wind carried the scent of late roses, a last burst of fragrance before winter. In the garden, the lights marked the path that Winona and Rowan had created together, each bed a story, each flower a shared moment. The next morning would bring new challenges, more reporters, more trials. But at that moment, under the starry Connecticut sky, Winona felt a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. It was the peace of someone who had finally found her own voice, her own path, even if that path was covered in thorns. The special board meeting of Rosewood Enterprises was scheduled for a chilly fall morning. Winona was getting ready in her room, carefully choosing a navy blue Chanel outfit, the color Herbert always said gave her strength. Margaret helped her with the pearls, her experienced hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to go," Margaret said softly. "Mr. Thorne could represent you." "No," Winona replied, adjusting the necklace in the mirror. "I'm not going to hide. The Rosewoods never hide." Downstairs, Catherine was waiting with Michael. Her youngest son had spent the last few days silently observing the dynamic between his mother and Rowan, his conclusions still kept to himself. "Mom," Michael said as she came down the stairs, "let me walk you down." "No, darling," Winona smiled, touching his face. "I need to do this alone. Besides, you have a flight to catch." "I can postpone it," he offered. But Winona shook her head. "Your wife is 8 months pregnant. Your place is with her now." In the garden, through the French windows, Rowan was working, preparing the beds for the coming winter. He looked up when Winona came out onto the terrace, and for a moment their gazes met, full of concern and determination. "I'll be fine," she said softly, more to herself than to him. The Rosewood Enterprises building in downtown Hartford was an imposing edifice of glass and steel, erected by Herbert in the 80s. Winona knew every corridor, every meeting room. How many Christmas parties, how many celebrations, how many important decisions had taken place there? Richard was waiting for her at the entrance to the boardroom, his suit impeccable and his expression tense. "Mother," he greeted formally, "the council is waiting." Inside the room, 12 familiar faces turned to her. Some were longtime friends of Herbert's. Others were younger executives she had seen grow up in the company. Dr. Peterson, the psychiatrist hired by Richard, was sitting in a corner, watching her intently. "Good morning, everyone," Winona said, her voice clear and firm. "Before you start with your assessments and diagnoses, I'd like to say a few words." Richard made a point of interrupting her, but she held up her hand, silencing him with a gesture so reminiscent of Herbert that several counselors stirred in their chairs. "For 45 years, I was Herbert Rosewood's wife. I helped build this company as much as anyone in this room. When Herbert was traveling, it was I who organized the dinners with investors. When he needed advice at 3 in the morning, I was the one he talked to." She paused, looking at each face around the table. "Now you've been summoned to judge my sanity. Why? Because at 72, I discovered that I can still feel love? Because I chose to live instead of just existing?" "Mrs. Rosewood," Dr. Peterson interjected gently, "no one is questioning your right to happiness. But there is a legitimate concern about..." "About what, doctor?" Winona interrupted him. "About the fact that Rowan is younger? About his imperfect past? Or about the scandal it might cause?" "About his emotional vulnerability," Richard added. "Mom, he has a history of mistakes?" Winona questioned. "Like all of us? Or have you forgotten that incident at Yale that your father and I helped cover up?" Richard paled, and several advisors looked away, uncomfortable. "I'm not here to ask permission," Winona continued. "I'm here to inform you that I will continue to live my life as I choose. My investments in the company will remain intact. My commitment to Herbert's legacy, unwavering. But my heart? It belongs to me." "What about the company's reputation?" one of the older advisors asked. "The company has survived wars, recessions, and far worse scandals," Winona replied. "It will survive the love of a widow." Dr. Peterson closed his briefcase, a small smile on his lips. "Ms. Rosewood, based on our conversation just now, I can say with certainty that you are in full control of your mental faculties. In fact, you display impressive emotional clarity." Richard looked stunned. "Doctor, you haven't even started the formal assessment?" "Sometimes," the psychiatrist replied, "5 minutes of observation are worth more than hours of tests. Your mother is perfectly sane, Mr. Rosewood, and more than that, she's living fully." When Winona left the building, the autumn sun shone faintly through the clouds. Catherine was waiting for her in the car, anxious for news. "How was it?" she asked as soon as Winona got in. "It was liberating," Winona replied, feeling a weight leave her shoulders. "I finally said everything that needed to be said." Back at the mansion, Winona found Rowan in the winter garden, finishing installing the protections against the approaching frost. When he saw her, he stopped his work, his eyes full of concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked softly. In response, Winona approached him and, for the first time in public, took his hand. "It's better than fine," she smiled. "It's perfect." On the terrace, Margaret watched the scene with tears in her eyes, remembering all the springs that garden had seen, all the winters it had survived. Like Winona herself, always bloomed again, stronger and more beautiful with each season. Love, after all, was like the most resilient flowers in the garden, capable of springing up in the most unlikely places, defying expectations and time, transforming the world with its unexpected beauty. The first snowflakes of winter were beginning to fall on Hartford when Richard showed up at the Rosewood mansion unannounced. Winona watched him through the winter garden window, her eldest son looking strangely vulnerable as he crossed the snow-covered path towards the house. "Ma'am," Margaret announced softly, "young Mr. Rosewood is here." Winona nodded, adjusting her cashmere shawl. "Ask him to meet me here in the winter garden, Margaret. And please bring some of that jasmine tea Herbert liked so much." The conservatory, with its glass and wrought iron structure, was one of the last additions Rowan had made to the estate. The orchids he had cultivated with such care bloomed in defiance of the cold outside, their vibrant colors contrasting with the white of the snow that accumulated on the glass panels. Richard entered hesitantly, his eyes scanning the transformed environment. "This is different from what I remembered," he commented, noting the new facilities in the abundance of plant life. "Rowan has a special gift," Winona replied, indicating the chair in front of her, "like his father had for business." The mention of Herbert made Richard fidget uncomfortably. "About that, Mom, I came to apologize." Winona kept her silence, years of social experience teaching her that sometimes silence is the most eloquent response. "Michael called me last night," Richard continued, accepting the cup of tea Margaret had brought. He told me about the conversation he had with Rowan, about his grandmother, about how he uses part of his salary to pay for her treatment." "Yes," Winona confirmed. "The same determination you have to protect our family, he has to take care of his." Richard took a sip of his tea, his eyes fixed on the orchids. "You know, when Dad died, I promised myself that I would take care of you, that I wouldn't let anything or anyone hurt you again." "Oh, Richard," Winona sighed, reaching out to touch her son's hand. "You're so like your father, always wanting to control everything, protect everyone. But sometimes, the greatest protection we can offer is to allow people to be free to make their own choices." "But what if those choices are wrong?" he asked, his voice betraying a vulnerability that Winona rarely saw. "Like your choices at Yale?" she asked softly. "Or like when you decided to marry Jennifer against everyone's advice?" Richard lowered his eyes, remembering his own controversial marriage, which turned out to be one of the best decisions of his life. "It's different," he muttered, "but without the old conviction." "No, it's not," Winona smiled. "It's about trusting your heart, even when everyone says you're wrong. Your father understood that when you brought Jennifer home, and now, I'm asking you to understand it too." At that moment, Rowan appeared at the entrance to the winter garden, stopping abruptly at the sight of Richard. "Sorry, I didn't know you were visiting. I'll come back later." "No," Richard stood up, surprising both Winona and Rowan. "Please stay. Actually, I think we should talk." What followed was one of the most honest conversations that ever took place in the winter garden of the Rosewood mansion. Richard heard about Rowan's childhood in a small town in Maine, about how his grandmother raised him alone after his parents died, about his dreams of having his own nursery one day. "You really love gardening," Richard observed, noticing the sparkle in the other man's eyes when he talked about his plants. "As much as you love your father's company," Rowan replied. "Each plant has its own story, its own specific need. Like every investment or business decision." Winona watched the interaction with a heart full of hope. It was like seeing two different seasons finding common ground, learning to coexist. "Mom," Richard turned to her after the long conversation, "I still have my reservations, but I understand now, and I apologize for making everything so public, so difficult." "Life is rarely easy, dear," Winona smiled, "but it's always more bearable when you have the support of those you love." That evening, after Richard had left, Winona and Rowan walked through the snow-covered garden. The strategically placed lights created an almost magical setting, with ice crystals sparkling like diamonds in the trees. "Your son is a better man than he believes himself to be," Rowan commented, holding Winona's hand. "As are we all," she replied, pausing to observe a lone sparrow seeking shelter in one of the bushes. "Sometimes we just need the opportunity to show it." The snow continued to fall gently, covering the garden in a blanket of white that promised protection for the dormant plants until next spring. It was a reminder of the cyclical nature of life, moments of dormancy followed by new beginnings, always with the promise of renewal. "You know," Winona said, her voice soft in the silent night, "Herbert always said that a well-kept garden is like a good family. It needs time, patience, and a lot of love to flourish." Rowan smiled, understanding the depth of that comparison. "And sometimes it needs someone from outside to bring a new perspective, a new kind of care." There, under the falling snow of Connecticut, two souls that fate had unexpectedly brought together contemplated the future that lay ahead of them. A future that, like the garden itself, promised surprises, challenges, and, above all, the constant possibility of new blooms. The end of winter was approaching Hartford, bringing with it the first signs of the imminent spring. Winona watched from the winter garden as the snow slowly melted, revealing the green shoots that stubbornly emerged from the still cold ground. It was a special morning. Michael had called the night before to announce the birth of his daughter, Winona's first grandchild. "Margaret," Winona called to her housekeeper, who was arranging some cushions nearby. "I think it's time we planned a welcome party for little Rose." "Rose?" Margaret smiled. "An appropriate name for this family." "Michael said he was inspired by the garden," Winona explained, touching the glass of the greenhouse where a delicate rose bush was beginning to show its first buds. "He and Sarah decided on it after their last visit here." The sound of familiar footsteps made Winona turn around. Rowan walked in carrying some new seedlings, his face flushed from the morning chill. Over the last few months, since his reconciliation with Richard, things had calmed down considerably. Hartford society still talked, of course, but the whispers had lost their poisonous force. "I've brought something special," Rowan announced, showing a small vase with a rare variety of rose. "It's a David Austin, perfect for celebrating the birth of your granddaughter." Winona felt tears well up in her eyes as she looked at the delicate peach-colored flower. "It's beautiful," she whispered, gently touching the petals. "How did you know I was thinking of a celebration?" "Because I know you," he replied simply, placing the vase on a nearby table. "And because family is important to you." The word family echoed in the heated space of the winter garden. In recent months, the lines that defined the Rosewood family had become more fluid, more inclusive. Catherine often brought her painting materials to capture Rowan working in the garden. Richard, although still reserved, had begun to consult Rowan about the possibility of creating a sustainable garden at the company's headquarters. "I'm thinking of inviting your grandmother to the celebration," Winona said, watching Rowan's reaction carefully. "If she's feeling well enough to travel from Maine." Rowan's face lit up with surprise and excitement. Are you sure?" "The Hartford Society." "Hartford Society has had its share of scandals this year," Winona laughed softly. "Besides, it's about time your grandmother got to know the garden that so inspired her grandson." Margaret, who had remained discreetly in the background, snorted softly. "Madam, Mrs. Catherine has just arrived, and she's brought Mr. Richard and Jennifer with her." Winona raised her eyebrows in surprise at her children's unannounced visit. In recent months, Their visits had become more frequent, but they rarely came together without a special occasion. On the terrace, Catherine hugged her mother warmly, while Richard and Jennifer maintained expressions that mixed nervousness and expectation. "We have news," Catherine announced, her eyes sparkling. "But first, we all need to sit down." Margaret quickly organized tea and cookies in the winter garden, where the group gathered among the flowers that defied the end of winter. Rowan was about to leave, but Richard surprised him. "Please stay," he said. This concerns you too." Jennifer, sitting next to her husband, held his hand in silent support. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "The company board met yesterday," he began. "We discussed a new sustainability and social responsibility project. Well, we'd like to propose a partnership." Rowan leaned forward slightly, puzzled. "What kind of partnership?" "Rosewood Enterprises wants to create a sustainable landscaping and gardening division," Richard explained, "starting with transforming corporate spaces into green areas, but eventually expanding into community projects. And we'd like you to lead the project." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of Margaret's teacups. Winona watched Rowan, seeing the same sparkle in his eyes that she recognized when he talked about his dream of having his own nursery. "It would be an opportunity to implement his ideas on a large scale," Catherine added, "and to create something truly meaningful. And your grandmother would have access to the best medical treatment in Connecticut," Jennifer added softly. Richard made sure to include a full health plan in the package. Winona felt her heart expand with pride, not just for Rowan, but for her children, who had found a way to accept and incorporate change into their lives. I don't know what to say," Rowan finally managed to articulate, his voice laced with emotion. "Say yes," Winona suggested softly. "Say that you will transform other spaces as you have transformed this garden." "But what about our work here?" he asked, looking around the winter garden they had created together. "This will always be your base home," Richard replied, surprising everyone with the naturalness of the statement. "The place where it all began." At that moment, a ray of sunshine broke through the glass panels of the conservatory, illuminating the David Austin rose that Rowan had brought in earlier. It was as if nature itself was blessing that moment of union and transformation. "So," Catherine smiled, "I think we have a lot to celebrate. A new Rosewood, a new project in a family that keeps growing in unexpected ways." The beginning of spring in Hartford brought with it not only the blooming of flowers, but also a series of changes to the Rosewood mansion. The winter garden had become the beating heart of the estate, where 3 generations of the family now gathered regularly. It was a particularly special morning. Little Rose, just 3 months old, would be making her first official visit to her grandparents' garden. Winona was overseeing the final preparations for the celebration, while watching Margaret coordinate the staff with her usual efficiency. "Mrs. Bennett has arrived," Margaret announced, referring to Rowan's grandmother. "Catherine is helping her settle into the guest room." Mrs. Bennett, a 75-year-old woman with green eyes identical to her grandson's, had moved to Hartford the week before, after accepting Winona's suggestion to be closer to her medical treatment. Her presence brought a new dimension to the family dynamic, especially since she shared with Winona not only a love of gardens, but also the experience of raising a family on her own. "Winona?" Rowan's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. He was standing at the entrance to the conservatory, wearing a well-cut suit, a significant change from his usual work clothes. As director of Rosewood Enterprises' new landscaping division, he now alternated between corporate meetings and hands-on work in the gardens. "You look very elegant," she smiled, adjusting her own outfit, a lavender ensemble that Catherine had insisted she wear for the occasion. "I have something to show you before everyone arrives," he said, holding out his hand to her. "A special project I've been working on." He led her down a new path in the garden, carefully paved with old stones that she recognized from Herbert's old garden. As they advanced, Winona noticed a structure that hadn't been there before, a small gazebo surrounded by flowering vines. "Rowan," she whispered, thrilled to recognize the design. It was an exact replica of the gazebo where Herbert had proposed to her 50 years ago. The original had been destroyed in a storm decades before. "Catherine showed me an old photo," he explained softly. "I thought it would be a perfect place for our own story, without erasing the memories of the past." Inside the gazebo, a discreet plaque bore an inscription: "To Winona, who taught me that love, like a well-kept garden, can flourish in any season. All my love, Rowan. Marry me," he said simply, holding her hands. "Not because we have to, not because the world expects it, but because we choose each other, every day." Before Winona could reply, she heard voices approaching. Michael and Sarah arriving with little Rose, followed by Richard and Jennifer, Catherine with her new boyfriend, and Mrs. Bennet being pushed in her wheelchair by Margaret. "I think we have an audience," Winona laughed softly, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Well?" Rowan asked, her green eyes shining with love and anticipation. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm and clear. "1,000 times yes." The applause and expressions of joy that followed echoed through the garden, scaring off some sparrows that had nested in the vines. Richard was the first to approach, surprising everyone by hugging Rowan tightly. "Welcome officially to the family," he said, his voice breaking, "although you've been part of it for a long time." Little Rose, in Sarah's arms, let out a happy squeal, as if she too wanted to join in the celebration. Catherine already had her sketch pad out, capturing the moment with quick, emotional strokes. "I knew this would happen," Mrs. Bennet commented with a knowing smile. "From the first time Rowan told me about this garden and the extraordinary woman who owned it." Margaret discreetly wiped away tears as she poured champagne for all the adults. "Mr. Herbert would be happy," she whispered to Winona. "He always said that the greatest proof of love is wanting each other to be happy." The celebration continued throughout the day, with more family members arriving: cousins, nephews, close friends who had become family by choice. The garden, in full spring bloom, seemed to celebrate together, its colors more vibrant, its aromas more intense. At dusk, when most of the guests had left, Winona and Rowan walked hand in hand through the garden they had created together. Each flower bed told a story of their love, from their first shy conversations to the courageous decisions that had brought them there. "Do you know what I love most about you?" Rowan asked, stopping next to the rose bush he had planted the day Rose was born. "Your courage to bloom, no matter the season." Winona smiled, thinking about how life had changed since that first morning she had seen him working in her abandoned garden. "And do you know what I love most about you? Your ability to see beauty where others see only time gone by." On the horizon, the Connecticut sun was setting in shades of pink and gold, painting the sky with the same colors as the roses that surrounded the new gazebo. The Rosewood mansion, which had once seemed too big and too quiet for Winona, now pulsed with new life and new possibilities. "Forever is made up of many nows," Winona said softly, remembering something Herbert used to say. "And every now is a chance to bloom again." Rowan kissed her softly, there among the flowers that had witnessed the birth and growth of their love. A love that, like the garden itself, had blossomed against all odds, transforming not only their lives, but those of everyone around them. Spring had come to stay in the heart of the Rosewood mansion, promising endless seasons of new beginnings and everlasting flowers.